Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, PM Anthony Albanese gets Time magazine's tick of approval. Should big polluting countries be paying for damage caused by climate change? We'll hear from a young climate activist from the Pacific who is leading the charge. And school's out for Easter, but is the family holiday actually anyone's idea of a good time? Can go badly wrong. Joining me on the panel, CBD columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Kishor Napier-Raman. Thanks for being in.
Always a pleasure, Alan.
Here in person, City of Sydney councillor and chairwoman of the Australian South Sea Islanders Port Jackson, Emelda Davis is here.
Hi.
I think we've ever met in person.
I know, it's really nice to meet you.
It's very nice to meet you.
And everybody.
Adjunct Professor at the University of Queensland and former Ambassador Ian Kemish is in Brisbane, where I'd like to be tonight, but I'm in Sydney. G'day, Ian.
G'day, Alan. Hi, everyone.
And Principal Legal Officer of the Queensland Indigenous Family Violence Legal Service, Thelma Schwartz, is in Cairns tonight, where the entire panel would love to be. G'day, Thelma.
Hi from beautiful Gimli country.
Thank you. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. Some of the finest legal minds in the country, including two former High Court judges, have given evidence to a parliamentary committee examining the voice to Parliament today. Now, the committee is stress testing the proposed changes to the Constitution that will be put to all of us Australians in a referendum later this year. And their verdict? Just one of the 7 constitutional experts has concerns. Greg Craven is worried the government could be swamped with High Court challenges if they fail to adequately listen to the official voice of First Nations Australians when they come up with official policy.
At the very least, there's a very significant problem that judicial activity will delay, possibly very, very considerably, the taking of executive decisions. My view is with constitutions you don't take risks because they're going to be there pretty well forever and they're very important. So my view would be that you would eliminate that risk.
But Greg Craven's view was not shared by other experts.
So we're saying the High Court will go contrary to the words of the Constitution, despite the fact that the High Court has previously said that it's the text that's controlling, and yet still come to this kind of implication, which everyone has said that if it was drawn, would have catastrophic effects on government by gumming up the system and making government ungovernable. Do we really seriously think that the High Court is in a position that it would do that? And my answer is no, I'm sorry, I don't.
This is not a set of words which would give rise to this mythical procession of meritless cases, or to put it another way, good luck to one of my colleagues who gets the bomb of that brief. Maybe it'll be me, who knows. All I can say is it'll be a very difficult argument, and I suspect a very short one.
Dan Bourchier is a Drum host and the ABC's Voice correspondent. He's been following today's hearings and joins us from Canberra. Dan, I'm not sure that it amounts to a hell of beans, this debate, but gee, it was a terrific thing to see all these egos and brains strutting. We were trying to come up in the studio with a collective noun for constitutional lawyers. Emelda thinks an entourage of constitutional lawyers is what we should go with.
Someone that's a bit more impolite might say a cluster, but that wouldn't be me. But I tell you what, it was really fascinating to watch, wasn't it? To hear the type of language that we heard from some of the most senior legal minds in the nation. Most of those that were there today were on the for side of the voice to Parliament and the referendum. There were just 2 that were really on the no side and the negative side. Then there were also people that were there involved in the process leading up to this, including Auntie Pat Anderson and others. And so what we really got a sense of is this pressure testing of the 92 odd words that are in this piece of legislation that, it must be noted, is only a couple of pages long. And that's really what they're going to be looking at over the coming weeks before the government hopes that this legislation really gets passed next month or into June, so that the campaign in earnest can kick off before we all go to a vote sometime later in the year.
And so Greg Craven, who was up first, he was the fellow with the concerns, and everybody else said, no, they didn't have concerns. But his essential concern was this, that if you look at the proposed changes that are going to be made, well, first of all, it says that there's going to be words to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Then there's going to be an establishment of a voice, which means a representative body that will speak on behalf of grassroots people to be able to say, hey, this piece of legislation you've introduced, it just doesn't work on the ground. We've spoken to grassroots people, it doesn't work. Then there's the provision for the voice to make representations to government. Then there comes the rub, according to Greg Craven, of, well, hang on, what if people turn around and say, well, hang on, you haven't heard our representations? Or what if somebody says, you haven't asked for our representations? Or what if somebody says, well, we gave you our representations, but you didn't listen? You didn't listen? And so every time they want to put up a new lighthouse or buy a new submarine or do anything, we're all marching to the High Court, government grounds to a halt.
Well, and we certainly heard from some of those constitutional legal experts saying that, you know, that would be akin to being mythical, that the court is not going to allow that at first instance, and that there's a really strong view of the court that it's not going to take on vexatious sorts of cases. But of course, there is another lens to put across this, Ellen, and that's that any other part of the Constitution or any other body within Australia can be taken to the High Court, that's part of our rule of law, that is the very spotlight of the law that means that justice must be done and be seen to be done, is to have that process that's available to it. But in terms of whether or not that it would be a lawyer's picnic and that there would be these entourages leading to the High Court, well, two justices, including a former Chief Justice that have sat on the court for many years, said, well, look, that's just not the case. Greg Craven has also got some other issues with some of the elements, including around executive government. So just how far and wide could the advice of the voice go?
Yes.
And we've heard some people saying, look, it could go to subs, as you say. It could be about defence procurement. It could be to the Reserve Bank governor and the like. Well, that was a question that was put really early on in the day to Megan Davis, Professor Megan Davis, who's been really influential as a constitutional lawyer in all of these processes over the last decade or so. And she made a really powerful point, I thought, and that was that the way that the voice operates, determined by the legislative parameters that the Parliament will set and can change from time to time, will really govern the type of work that the voice does, and that a big part of this will be the way that the voice sees itself and what it's trying to achieve. Because if it wants to have impact, she was really saying, then it's going to be incredibly focused, and it'll be on matters that have direct and over-proportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not all matters of the nation. So there's a whole lot to weigh up in some of that early evidence that was given today as well.
Yeah, that's well put. Thelma, this is interesting because you're a lawyer, and Toomey, who gave a lot of advice today, she's a lawyer, but in the end she came up with sort of the practicalities of the matter, as Dan was saying there. She said the level of your influence anywhere in the world, if you want to be the voice representing the views of First Nations people in Canberra, your influence only goes as far as the level of your expertise. She said if you're going to rock up to government as the Aboriginal voice and say, I think you should buy those French submarines, not those Yankee ones, they'll put that in the bin. And besides which, all those community folks out, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country will go, what in God's name are you doing? They're not issues that are central to what you should be talking about. So practicalities and politics will take care of it, in her view.
Absolutely. I'm in no way, shape or form a constitutional lawyer, but I certainly am a lawyer, and you do get an understanding of the machinations in which the High Court operates. You get an understanding of what matters can and can't proceed to court. And by all means, what has been said today, from my understanding, by the majority of constitutional law experts, have really allayed, I would state, these so-called fears that are being put out there that the High Court is going to be awash with a sea of litigation. We seem to forget that the High Court, like any other court in this country, has the ability to adjudicate upon matters with merit. And we come back to what we were discussing earlier, that in respect of the voice, there must be an element where there is a direct and over-proportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I mean, we've got a threshold. So if the voice is purporting to make representations in areas that they cannot show that threshold a direct and overproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons, one would think that those would be representations that the elected members of the Voice would, as you've indicated, be held to account by members within community at the grassroots. Because they will be saying, as you've rightfully pointed out, how does this improving outcomes for us in the middle of nowhere, where we don't have access to housing, where we don't have access to drinkable water, where we have to worry about the safety of our children at night time, where violence is rampant? How does that impact us? And I think, with respect, when I've been watching this, there is a lot of fear-mongering, and probably quite deliberate fear-mongering, and a distortion of what the practical realities are when people go to court, include going to the highest court in our country, the High Court.
Kishor, you know, while it's possible to drown in constitutional matters, which I personally enjoy, but I have been called a nerd, and not kindly in the news today. There is subsection 129.3, which says Parliament's the decider. So Aboriginal voices, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice can make representations, but Parliament gets to decide. Now, if this committee, looking at the wording, and comes to the view, listening to all these folks, and says, you know what, that's okay, that wording's okay, are we suddenly going to see the Liberal and National parties and all the other people who are determined to push on with a no campaign suddenly saying, oh, okay, right, you're quite right. In other words, what's this about?
Good one. I mean, I can't see the Liberals and the Nationals moving or budging on this because, look, I think Peter Dutton's position makes sort of cynical, cold, hard political sense for him. Firstly, you've got the two Indigenous women in his joint party room who are against the Voice, and he probably, there's an element of this is like the kind of cynical political Hail Mary, right? That if the Albanese government takes the Voice to the people and loses, that causes them to implode, and that's his best shot at coming back in. So I think there's like an element of political cynicism behind some of the opposition to the Voice. But I also think that, you know, like you've said, throughout this sort of early stages of the referendum campaign, you've seen a lot of quite spurious arguments about lawyers' picnics, about the High Court, about that kind of thing. I actually think that this committee is probably good for the Yes campaign because there are probably people that are a bit unsure, a bit uncertain, and, you know, having experts clearing up. What was the claim from Susan Lee today? Will this be used to cancel Anzac Day? Like, no. So, you know, being able to clear up things like that is probably good for the Yes side, but will this whole situation change any of the loud voices who are opposed to the Yes campaign? Probably not.
But I wasn't making any comment about whether or not those people campaigning for no were doing so in a way that was authentic and genuine. Merely that the inquiry's coming after they've decided. Right? The order.
Yes, precisely.
Is the point.
When people are in politics, you know, it's very hard to change your mind when you've publicly made a statement, right? So I don't see any kind of backing down or anything like that, no.
Do you think this convinces anyone one way or the other? I mean, this might be
this process?
Yeah, fun chat for us on a Friday night on the drum. I'm sure
what I mean? And I think people do tune in to great shows like this that are very sort of layman terms and but I'm not looking to sit and watch constitutional lawyers discuss, you know, the wording of the Voice because we're too busy putting food on the table and trying to work out, you know, where the next gig's coming from in terms of survival. But, you know, I think democracy is a beautiful thing and, you know, it is important that these discussions happen and the people will decide. So let's just get on with the business. You know, you've got the major parties and you've got Liberal pushback, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of goodwill out there. I don't underestimate everyone that I've come across. It seems positive, but they do ask the questions, and hopefully those questions were answered today. Yeah, you know.
Yeah. Well, former High Court Justice Kenneth Hayne addressed the concern raised by some opponents of the Voice that the Australian Constitution should be colourblind, should not address race, and should treat all Australians equally.
The argument, whether it's framed as an argument about race, colourblindness, or equality, is, I think, an argument that fails to engage with what this proposal is doing. This proposal is responding to history and entrenched disadvantage.
That was a really interesting little speech that he made there, Dan. He was saying, look, the law does not treat people in different situations the same. They treat people in the same situations the same. The other point that he was making was in terms of colour blindness, this is responding to history and the results of historical invasion, dispossession, all the rest of it. And so therefore, in that sense, that addresses the issue of equality. And that's a big one, isn't it? That's a big thing you hear people say, Dan.
Oh, it's enormous, and it's one that comes up regularly, and I think it goes to some of the campaigning around the voice to Parliament, that it is introducing new race powers, and that's really something that Robert French, the former Chief Justice, also went to in his evidence late this afternoon, where he was saying, look, it's just not about that. It's about looking at the scope of history, at the 65,000 or more years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inhabitation and connection to this very land that we're on right now, and also having a really clear understanding of the weight of history that has led to this moment of the last 230 odd years, and the way that that's shaped and impacted on contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all walks of life, affected in very many different ways. And so he was making the point in such a powerful and eloquent way, I thought, that this is also about how to find that middle ground between our constitution, which is a relatively stuffy document that is not about the glossy terms of how we live our lives, but is about a division of power. And then also, how do you integrate into that and bring in that voice, if you will? But then on the other side of that, of course, we also heard today from Louise Clegg, who's a prominent barrister, and has been told me today that, look, she thinks that there needs to be some form of a voice, and that she's very strongly supportive of reconciliation, but she's worried about the frame of this one. In particular, in the past, she's said that it would be a fourth arm of government, and today, as part of the evidence, said that this is a very significant right, the likes of which a liberal democratic institution has never seen. So we certainly heard a whole range of perspectives, but I also want to go to one quote from Megan Davis that happened earlier today, where she was asked again about this point about executive government, and would there be measures or mechanisms that could be put in place to really safeguard against the just issuability or the ability for people to take matters to the High Court. And she said, look, I'm not going to comment on that. I'm not getting into something that is just not clear and that we're not talking about. And then she said this, Ellen, that I thought was really fascinating. That, quote, my concern about the debate and discussions out in the discourse around this provision is that people are actually throwing up the most extreme examples to try and scare the Australian people that this isn't actually quite a modest and conservative provision. Now, of course, that's something that we've heard many other people say, but in that sequence of words from Megan Davis, I thought was sending a very strong and clear message about trying to cut through some of the campaigning and some of the other things that are being said about this.
Ian, as Emelda said, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, and any time you change the Constitution, you're doing something pretty profound. And there's always a risk involved in it. You don't necessarily know what the implications of that will be, how it will be interpreted in the future by the High Court. And the other thing that seems to be coming through is this tension around, well, is this a provision that gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people some power or not?
Yeah. Look, I think it's extraordinary how much political energy is being put into thinking about all the possible ways this could go wrong,
right.
When in the end, this is actually a pretty simple proposal about providing First Nations people with the opportunity to have input on issues that are important to them. Yes, I do take the point that you're relaying, but let's remember, the High Court of Australia itself does not have its operational structure spelled out in our Constitution. It's mentioned in our Constitution. It was Parliament that sorted out how it would work, how it would be structured. And here we are agonising over all the possible things that might go wrong in what is a very, very simple proposal let's trust the Australian people. Frankly, I think that I do back the judgment of the Australian people here. I don't think they're tuning into this stuff at all, and that they'll make decisions more broadly on a sense of justice around this issue. I certainly hope that's right. But in the end, this really feels a bit like insider baseball. I take Kishor's point though. I mean, there's a utility in the sense that there's an opportunity to knock down clearly false negative arguments against it along the way. Nonetheless, I don't think this is going to change votes, this discussion.
Dan, you're in your hometown tonight. You're probably 20 minutes from your front door. Lucky you. Thanks for joining us. Great to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure. Good to be with you.
Dan Bourchier, the ABC's Voice correspondent, host of this very program. Anthony Albanese is making quite the impression on global stage. Time magazine has just released its much anticipated list of the 100 most influential people of the year, and Albo has made the cut. It's only the second time an Australian PM has been featured and comes just 11 months after he was elected. He joins US President Joe Biden, Germany's PM Olaf Schwartz and Ukraine's First Lady in being recognised as an exemplary world leader. Canada's PM, Justin Trudeau, penned Mr Albanese's entry and clearly considers him a worthy inclusion.
Progressives around the world are united in the idea that we should leave no one behind. Few politicians embody that journey as Anthony Albanese does, from growing up in public housing to taking office last spring as Australia's new Prime Minister. He's a symbol of hope and inspiration. In a world where people are increasingly uncertain about what the future holds for them and their families, it's easy for politicians to sow fear and division. To choose the path of hope and opportunity takes immense courage, and that courage lives within Anthony Albanese.
Soccer great Lionel Messi and billionaire Elon Musk also made the list. Gosh, Emelda, Albo.
Good story.
Yeah?
Yeah, good news story. Why not?
Yeah.
Because he come out punching, and the first thing he said when he was elected is that he's going to, you know, empower the voice to Parliament. So good, but very elite, you know, like who else is on the list? And I think there's a lot of worthy people. I know it's been a short time frame since he's been elected, but I guess, you know, the body of work maybe they're looking at. I don't know what the application looks like when they're assessing it, but, you know, it's very elitist, of course. But I can think of, you know, many others that could be on that list from a grassroots perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, look, I'm not here to take it away from him.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Justin Trudeau, man, he was laying it on thick, wasn't he?
Yeah. Oh well.
Thelma, what do you think?
Sorry, I'm going to be that bit of a stickler here. 100 days in, what have you actually achieved? Now, I admire your guts and determination to tell us what you were going to do the night that you won the election. We are now in the trenches trying to push through constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in this country. This has been a battle going on since this country was invaded 200 plus years ago. And yes, I'm probably going to be called out in my private capacity. I support a voice to Parliament. And yes, I'm probably going to be labelled as an elitist quite unfairly, not knowing the true reality of where I came from and the fact that I was the first member of my family to finish high school, to actually graduate with a degree from a university and to practice law in this country. Certainly not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. The proof in the pudding for me will be his ability to lead us as a nation, to take up that olive branch that was put out in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, to walk with us to reconcile and heal this country. And whilst I can appreciate the very kind and generous words of Trudeau, he's got a lot with respect to prove. He needs to get this voice across. He needs to steer us out of the economic uncertainty that we are currently in. We're struggling with the cost of living crisis, homelessness that we have not seen since the days of the Depression in this country. There is more to being a leader than selling us the dream. I actually need to see actuality with respect.
Ian, what do you think? You know, from the distance, right, of Ottawa or wherever else they're making these decisions, they're seeing in Albanese. Because up close, we can all see what Thelma's just said, the immense challenges that he has yet to meet, necessarily because his government is so young.
Exactly. And look, these judgments are made from a distance and they're not complicated by close knowledge of the detail of the politics and the partisan issues that we're dealing with here in Australia. They're based a little bit on an impression, I think, of the man, and there is a little bit of the Albanese personal story, you know, from Housing Commission home to Prime Ministership that is in the background of this. But it's also about Australia's own projection right now. I was an ambassador in Europe when there was another sea change in Australian politics in 2007. And trying to leave the Australian partisan politics out of it, the impression that was created in the international arena was one of a new government that was suddenly signing on to the Kyoto Protocol, apologising to our First Nations people. And there was an enormous positivity in response to that. I think this is to some extent about a different kind of Australian projection right now, not only about Anthony Albanese. But look, I mean, I was just listening to that last point. There's still plenty to do and plenty to prove. Totally agree. I'm reminded slightly, I think it's overstating it, but I'm reminded slightly by, remember how Barack Obama managed to receive the Nobel Prize effectively for being elected. It was very short after his taking on the presidency that he received that prize, and I'm not sure he knew exactly what to do about it. The point was, it was a bit early, and Obama hadn't actually done anything yet at the time.
Yeah. What was the reaction amongst you political reporters? Albanese Times, well, not exactly Man of the Year, but he's on the short list, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, much like Justin Trudeau himself, all these things are a little bit sort of style over substance, I suppose. And like everyone's been saying, you know, he hasn't been around for very long. He hasn't had an opportunity to do very much. I think, like, kind of building on what Ian was just saying there, a lot of this is the sort of the contrast in the eyes of the international community, and it's telling what Trudeau cited there. He cited climate change and he cited sort of movement on Indigenous issues. So that it goes to show just how crucial to Albanese's sort of credibility and his legacy, you know, making sure the yes vote gets up and we get that much needed constitutional reform, right? It's crucial to how I think the rest of the world is going to view Australia. And I think that's sometimes maybe forgotten in the very, very arcane debate about the Constitution and constitutional law and High Court challenges that we just talked about. There's a lot at stake here in terms of like how the world views our country. And I think like that's not something to be sneered at. That's going to be very important. I think the projection of Australia and how we deal with reconciliation, how we deal with our own historical injustices and First Nations people is going to be really important. And, you know, I think given that we haven't got there yet, maybe this is a little bit premature. And
Ian, do you think that to some extent this is as much an award for Penny Wong in terms of how she has reshaped the projection of Australian soft power in the world?
Well, I do. I mean, if this is, as I suspect, recognition of a very different kind of projection by Australia, then yeah, I think our Foreign Minister deserves a very serious chunk of all of this. And I suspect Anthony Albanese would make that point himself. He's been part of it too, and he has been a good partner. But Penny, absolutely, you know, an absolutely terrific Foreign Minister who's really shown some real strength in difficult circumstances over the course of the last year or so.
Do you think he's changed politics?
Has he changed politics? I mean, does anyone change politics in a year?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? You know, like when the whole country turns blue, we say, oh, that's it, the Labor Party is gone forever and this is the new politics in Australia. And now that there's a tendency to say that here. Do you see, looking at it close up, that it is a kindler, gentler politics, or it's just a different politics?
I mean, if you're dealing with politicians and the Canberra bubble up close, then it never really looks that different. And I think, look, there are kind of overtures towards trying to create a kind of gentler politics. You know, we've had stuff like the Jenkins Review and all that kind of thing in terms of changing the culture within politics, but that stuff happens slowly. It doesn't happen overnight with one change in Parliament House or at the ballot box. So, you know, in terms of changing politics, I think that's a very high bar. But, you know, I think zooming out, like Albanese's probably performed pretty well in his first year. I mean, you had a great litmus test, which was the Aston by-election last month, where the voters are, you know, they're marking him pretty highly. And, you know, in terms of proactivity in government, I mean, he's made moves on climate, he's made moves on The Voice, he's made moves on an integrity commission, all things that the last government just didn't really do. So, and all things he took to the electorate. So by all those accounts, the government's kind of functioning pretty well. Has it changed politics for good overnight? I mean, no, but that's an absurdly high bar to put on someone, right?
Now, I love this story. I'm thrilled to bring it to you. A fortnight ago, the United Nations made a big decision. Stay with me. An overwhelming majority of nations agreed that the highest court on the planet should rule on this question: what legal consequences should individual countries face if they contribute to climate change? The outcome might mean that nations like Australia, which continue to sell fossil fuels, could be sued for the damage they cause, particularly to small island nations and their citizens, who are among the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The legal advice could herald a profound shift in the fight for climate justice. Wait for this, as Lonnie Cooper explains, it was devised in a university classroom by a group of law students from the Pacific.
It's been hailed as the beginning of a new era.
We have witnessed a win for climate justice of epic proportions.
Following a push from Vanuatu, the United Nations has voted to ask the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, for a legal opinion on the responsibility of nations to protect the global climate. The legal advice could compel countries to take stronger action on climate change, as well as potentially compensate other nations that are severely affected.
Importantly, the court will tell us what the legal consequences are for states that disregard these laws and cause climate and environmental harm.
Vanuatu has been campaigning for the UN resolution for 4 years. The country, which itself has net zero carbon emissions, is one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Well, heavy rain and winds of up to 200 kilometres an hour have battered Vanuatu.
Vanuatu's leaders were driven to act by a group of young Pacific Islands climate activists. 27 law students hatched the ambitious plan to call for legal advice from the ICJ back in 2019 in a study group at uni. They formed a collective, the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, and have been pushing other nations to support the resolution ever since.
We're calling out to you, International Court of Justice.
4 years on, the movement has gained the support of more than 100 nations, including Australia, but not the US.
Today, the world has come together to really put human rights at the centre of climate change discussion.
The resolution's been especially welcomed by other countries that have experienced climate disaster.
We hope this resolution and the consequent advisory opinion will provide a better understanding of the legal implications of climate change under international law and the rights of present and future generations to be protected from climate change.
The International Court of Justice is expected to finalise its legal advice by the end of next year.
Calling out to you.
And the President of Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, Cynthia Houniuhi, joins us now. Thank you so much. We've been dying to have you on the program for such a long time. You're in Canberra and we're thrilled you're here.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted you to take me back to that moment in the classroom, the University of the South Pacific, a group of law students. There's you and 26 other students sitting around. You're doing a project on climate change and human rights. How were you 27 students affected by climate change in your homes?
Well, yeah, so 4 years ago, in that classroom, the initial members, most of the students there were from Pacific Island countries. That's the good thing about the University of South Pacific. It houses a lot of students from around the region. So knowing that we all come from the Pacific Islands, we are all on the front line of the climate adverse effects. And so the 27 students that were initially the members of this youth-led organization now, they have their different climate stories that they brought to the table. So that was the motivation that, we see our leaders going onto the international stage, negotiating. We see our communities trying to build seawalls and trying to adapt, doing their part. So we as law students, we were challenged, what could we do to add to this, add to the solutions that our people are trying to get, because this is, we have a lot to lose at stake. So with our different climate stories, that was the motivation that pushed us to begin this journey in that classroom.
And it was an audacious idea. I mean, let's get the highest court on the planet involved. Hey, could that happen? But before you tell me that piece, tell me your own climate story. Tell me about what happens in the Solomon Islands, just a 5-hour flight northeast of Cairns, where Thelma is tonight.
Solomon Islands, we have people that live on the coastal areas. We also have people that live on the mountains, the bushland. So our people are affected differently. You have people on the coastal side. The most visible effects of climate change is sea level rise. So, for example, personally for me, my father is from the Malaitan province, so South Malaita, and there is an island there called Whanalei, and it is one of the islands that recently we've seen that people have started to move inland. So before we used to see a lot of people there. It is a home to a lot of families. They've brought up the children there. Their ancestors had memories there. They are connected to the land. But now they are not of their own choice. They have to move because these lands have become uninhabitable for them. So those are some personal insight to my personal climate story. But we also have other islands around Solomons that have also faced different adverse effects of climate change, and we also have those on the bushland, with a lot of intense and frequency of the rainfalls. We live off our land, so you can, when your food, the place that you get your food is threatened, you will have to look somewhere else. And for these people, we're already struggling with other issues that we have. So this is making it even more worse for our people.
Emelda, what do you think listening to that? These law students driven by this sense of injustice, right? These are the people facing the most severe impacts, and they're the least responsible for causing the problem, right?
It's an absolute disgrace, and this High Court or the
International
Court of Justice decision, is welcomed with open arms. Let's hope that there's follow through and real change that comes from this, because I've experienced this firsthand in working with Cyclone Pam and Winston, and now more recently trying to support Vanuatu yet again. We're depleted here in this country trying to provide national disaster resources for our families back home. So I think leadership needs to open the doors. Those that are sort of, I guess, in the space where there's an opportunity for real change, we need to have open and transparent discussions with all communities, because only we, the grassroots people in our homes, can make that difference. Yeah, we can sit around and talk about it all day, and I'm not undermining processes like the conference and things like that are going on, but it's only available to a few, and they should be either streamed live or welcomed, for people to participate who are in a certain financial circumstance that can't afford to
get to the conference,
to get involved, because it's a global education process. Yeah. It's not something that we can just,
But I'm interested in your response to seeing this young woman.
Oh, I'm just sad. I just wanted to cry. It's really terrible, to witness this sort of thing. And
but at the same time, this advocacy, this
formidable
youth advocacy from the Pacific, it's a global movement, right?
Look, and that's the thing. This is not new to our Pacific nations. Yeah, Australia's at the brunt of First Nations people suffering, you know, this climate change that needs to happen. And to see our young people rise above all of that and lead the way, lead the charge, you know, I commend you and thank you for that work. And incredibly proud of you. But at the same time, I go back to we need that openness and transparency and the greater involvement of grassroots and education for communities, because that's where the real change is going to come. If we all join hands, we collaborate and we work together, because otherwise we're already at, you know, I guess, tipping point, if not further, you know.
Thelma, what's interesting about what's been done here is an acknowledgement, right? At once, we're talking about loss and damage. To what extent should the countries who caused the damage be held accountable, legally accountable, for the damage that has been caused? But on the other hand, what's being said is these folks aren't going down without a fight.
And that's what I absolutely love and admire, and we need to see more of it. I would say, the traditional arguments that would be used to minimise and limit damages to show, well, there's no causal connection to us causing this damage, is a complete nonsense in a modern world. And by a modern world, I reflect and muse on the fact that we are a global economy. So what happens in the United States and the UK and Europe, for example, has a flow-on effect here in Australia and around the world. So we're now moving away from these arguments of limiting, purporting to limit liability, to say, well, you can't show a causal connection to us because of the nature in which we are a global community. We're a global community financially, and we must accept that we are a global community that shares one climate. We're all living in it. So I think, and I take my hat off to these young law students who've had the courage to stand up, and these Pacific Islander communities who are otherwise powerless. They don't have that economic nous as the economic powerhouses in the world to actually say enough is enough. What is it going to take for you to realise that what you're doing has a flow-on effect to us actually losing our homes, losing our connection to culture, losing our identity? And we're seeing that here in Australia in the Torres Strait. This is not something that hasn't impacted this country. We're seeing the flow-on effects of water levels, the sea coming into outer islands in the Torres Strait. But like most things, unfortunately, it's not a popular media discussion in mainstream media. Who wants to know about what's impacting out there in the middle of Whoop Whoop? And I suspect, with respect, this might have a bit to do with race. And yes, I'm bringing that R word in. We're talking about Pacific Islanders who are predominantly brown-coloured people. And that might be a bit of a curveball I'm bringing in here, but I'm talking frankly, and I'm talking about the fact that as a global community, we've got to actually come to a recognition that if we're going to survive the challenges that are currently affecting our world, we must come together. And there is none of this individualised, siloed, it's not my fault, I've got nothing to do with it, type of take on it. We're beyond that. We're in a very scary new dynamic, and I am absolutely so proud of what our young Pacific law students have done. Absolutely stand with you, because this is a fight that I see happening in my mother's home island and on my grandfather's island, where we are losing our traditional lands, we are losing our burial sites. My family are losing a place to live. So it's very real to me, and it touches me very deeply.
Cynthia, talk to me how it went from, how do you do activism on a global stage? So, okay, you've had this good idea. Someone said, okay, let's get the highest court on the planet to do it. Okay, what's step 2?
Well, to be honest, personally, when that idea was discussed, I was like, how, like, let's be real here, guys. How can 27 law students in the Pacific Island convince the majority of the United Nations General Assembly about this initiative. Let's be real. So I was very hesitant, but like Thelma has said as well, this is very real for us. So that pushed us beyond our fears, and so we started with the guidance of our lecturer. We started drafting a letter. And then we said, we will take this letter to our leaders in the Pacific, and then we'll also get our students in the campus. So we'll advocate on campus as well as get the leaders to come on board. And during the Pacific Islands Forum, we'll give the letter to them. We'll take our leaders to discuss that there, and then we'll take it on our behalf to the United Nations General Assembly. However, at first, it wasn't as successful as we thought. It was just, acknowledged and noted in the communique. But that didn't stop us. We really believe in the rule of law, and we believe that, that the International Court of Justice also share our vision about fair and just world. So that is why we kept on going by reaching out to other youths around the world as well, And then the leadership of Vanuatu really stepped in and brought in the momentum that we needed through a very inspirational leader, Minister Ralph Regunvanu. So from there, we just continued. There was a lot of talks, a lot of events. We just went on taking up spaces that we could to socialize the ideas to other youths as well. And then if we believe that if our governments could be convinced, other youths can convince their governments as well. So it was this youth movement that was very instrumental in this particular campaign.
Wow. Ian, Cynthia has said that they're standing on the shoulders of giants, people like Anote Tong, former Kiribati president, all sorts of leaders who have really embodied this new muscular foreign policy of the Pacific that says we are not tiny, impoverished little islands. We are a big blue ocean continent, 1/5 of the world's surface, I think it is, and you will listen to our voices on the global stage, and they are achieving that.
And above all, we exist. I mean, the way we often talk about the Pacific, certainly here in Australian public narrative, but more broadly internationally, is as if it's this vast, almost vacant expanse where we duke it out with the Chinese on behalf of the Western Alliance. It's almost as if there's no one else there. It's just a space for this geostrategic story. That was particularly the case around the time of our last election. We kind of neglect to say that there are people there and they have their own deep concerns about climate change and they have agency. And that's the wonderful thing about this story. It sends an absolute rebuff to that notion that the Pacific is just some empty space. It does have agency. Here we have young law students setting the match to a fuse which has led to serious action in the UN General Assembly, and we now have the International Court of Justice being invited to provide an advisory opinion which could well change all sorts of things. It will certainly help, I think, shift the global standard when it comes to how we think about this, how we think about human rights in the context of climate change, and may well affect the dynamics of negotiations for these countries. It's an extraordinary thing, and it's the people of the Pacific, the young people of the Pacific, with the support of their governments, who've got there. There are a lot of votes out there in the Pacific, and we need to remember that.
In the UN, they
Exactly.
each get a vote, right? They're a big bloc in the United Nations.
That's right. That's right, along with the Caribbean, another place where you can pick up a lot of votes. There is a real power to be had in their collective voice in our supreme international mechanisms, and they're to be commended for what they've achieved. It's an extraordinary thing, and it sends a bit of a message to the rest of us.
How does it work, Cynthia? So Australia co-sponsors this at the United Nations, but Australia is a major source of fossil fuels production in the world. So what does that mean? Do you welcome Australia's involvement? Do you appreciate when Australia says, look, we can't stop this export of fossil fuels? Because the world's not at the point of being able to turn all that off. You just have to be reasonable, Cynthia. You have to understand this point. What do you think of Australia in all this?
Well, we were really happy when they, supported the initiative and voted yes. But we all know from a lot of the IPCC report, about, what causes climate change already. So it's sort of, we need the full support, that is why this ICGO is very important, because it's an initiative that requires global effort. So not just half but full commitment on the international stage and as well as on the domestic stage as well. So that is why this ICGO is very important to clarify we, if we're still uncertain, it could mean certainty for us.
See, Kishor, when we think about how politics is done and how influence is had, we don't think of it in these terms, do we? If you think about domestic politics, you think about paid lobbyists, you think about real world, is anyone going to listen to international law in Australia? We break it all the time. But I wonder, in reality, what is the impact of Penny Wong sitting down in the Pacific over and over again and listening to these stories? Albanese the same, listening to these stories and taking the opposition with them, right, on those trips and listening to, like, you could be cynical and say, yeah, good luck with that. But what do you think that actually has at a human-to-human level of listening to story?
Oh, I think it's incredibly powerful. I mean, people in these Pacific Island nations should rightly be incensed, I think is probably the right word, with how the kind of collective Western world has dealt with their concerns and sort of just shrugged their shoulders at climate change, Australia especially. I think that there has been a far more proactive involvement in the Pacific from Penny Wong since the change of government. Some of that is often, like Ian said, there is this presumption that we just think about the Pacific as this space for kind of geopolitical tussles with China. We think about it through this really narrow, reductive national security sort of setting. But, the people on the ground in those countries, what they're worried about is the existential threat of climate. So, yeah, I think Penny Wong and people like that going down and sitting down with those leaders there is very important and very palpable. But also, like, just to your first point about who we think wields power and can change things, I mean, we've got this example here of young people in the Pacific shifting the dial in such a meaningful way. I mean, this is an advisory opinion from the ICJ, but it has the opportunity to kind of trickle down through the ways that courts all over the world maybe look at things. So, this is an example of people who we don't consider the kind of backroom boys or wielders of power actually changing things for the better. And I honestly wish we had more of that. Yeah.
And just a final question, Cynthia. You've been at a conference this week with lots of Pacific leaders called To Hell with Drowning. To Hell with Drowning. Where do you get your courage from to do this work?
I would like to share a story of one experience in this conference. So I'm in a classroom right now doing this, talking to you. And before I started, the former president of Kiribati came in the door, Anote Tong, and we were talking about how I appreciated we were given opportunities to hear from our leaders such as Meg Taylor and as well as Anote Tong. And he was sharing a story about, how he was in that space at the highest level possible and talking about climate change and still feeling like, am I making a fool of myself? Am I talking about something that no one's interested in? Having all those questions. And even after presenting, coming back and just thinking about, have I just, made a fool of myself and all that? It made me realize, our leaders have felt the same things, but because of their belief, this is an existential threat for us. We do not have the luxury to think about, our fears, because we want to protect not only our present future, but what about our children? I would like my children to also experience the same environment, the same culture, and live in dignity in the islands that my ancestors have walked on.
Cynthia, it's so lovely to meet you. It's just an honour. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, everyone, for the lovely discussion, and thank you for having me as well.
Cynthia Houniuhi is the president of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. And finally, it's school holiday time and many families are heading off for a break, but a word of warning: contain your expectations. That's coming from food and travel writer Natasha Maroshi. Way back in the 1970s, 11-year-old Natasha went on what she describes as the worst family holiday ever on a private island in the Whitsundays. The scene of the crime, Pool Island.
First one's here.
My dad is not usually the person who would book our family holidays. This was a once-off. He found this ad for an island that you could rent the whole entire island. It was on the Great Barrier Reef. The price was really, really good, so he booked it. When we got there, it wasn't at all this lush tropical island. It was dry, bone dry, and so hot. The pool of Pool Island, which I'd been looking forward to, was actually had about an inch of green, slimy water at the bottom of it with dead things floating in it. And being December, it was stinger season. So we had to swim fully clothed. The generator didn't work, so there was no air conditioning. There were no fans. As my aunt says, the adults drank a lot. Everybody was arguing, everybody hated each other. In fact, many of those family members don't talk to this day. In fact, it was so horrible, I was terrified that we were going to be left on the island. So I climbed a flagpole with a little mirror and I flashed the mainland to make sure that somebody knew that to come and get us.
Let's get away, let's get away.
My advice would be to research carefully. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
And not come back again.
See ya.
I love that story. It sounded so good, didn't it, Kishor? The tropical island, and everything went wrong. You've had that with a whale watching experience.
Yes, my holidays have not been quite as cursed as that one.
That was bad.
Oh, horrific. But no, yeah, I really wanted to go whale watching as a kid and always wanted to do it. And we went on this boat out of Sydney Harbour and it was just like, sideways rain. The waves were like, very large and I was quite small. Everyone was throwing up. I mean, like 90% of the boat was like over the side like this the entire time. So
spewing.
Even if, yeah, of course. And even if there were any whales, you were too busy looking at. We didn't see any whales, of course. But horrendous experience. But we could get off the boat. When you're stuck on an island, it's not that easy to get off,
No, islands. And the island is for sale. Apparently, really not a good idea. That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Kishor, Napier-Raman, Emelda Davis, Ian Kemish and Thelma Schwartz. Have a wonderful evening. John Barron is back with you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Good night.